everyone. Welcome to our Leaders in Conversation session, the Hopeful Leader. And please do chat to us as we go through the session. Tell us a little bit about yourself in the chat, who you are, where you're from, and also just how you're feeling. You've probably just come out of the work environment, so just give us a little bit of a sense of what are you feeling right now. Are you frazzled? Are you calm? Are you relaxed? Are you hopeful? Or are you not? Yeah. So I'm Jeanette Head. I'm the CEO of Boundless Wisdom, Boundless Leadership. For those of you who want to know why we are double-barreled boundless, we work with individual people wherever they find themselves at in our Boundless Wisdom component of our business. And we work with leaders in systems, in corporates, institutes, and in a variety of different systems. And that is where Boundless Leadership comes into it. So this evening, Crispin Swart, our host, is going to have a conversation with Rory van Merwe about the Hopeful Leader. I'm going to hand over straight away to Crispin to do the introductions. You may have attended our first session with Rory, which was late last year. And in fact, there was an overwhelming request and interest in Rory expanding on some of the inputs that he gave us about trauma and hope and where leaders are at late last year. And just to remember, if you'd like to catch up on that, we have videoed that. It is available on YouTube. We do have a short summary and a link available for that. You will find that posted on LinkedIn. But you might want to revisit that after you've had some information, more information. So please do enjoy. Keep chatting in the chat box. Make some comments. Put down some questions that you have that we can have a look at. And then we'll take the conversation from there. So over to you, Crispin.
Jeanette, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, or maybe good morning, depends on where you are. As Jeanette says, my name is Crispin. I see I've been spotlighted. Oh, goodness me. I must say that I look better on the picture than I do in real life. I don't know why that is. So I'll be your host this evening, and just said to Rory before we started that I'm looking forward to just sharing some of my own heart around the topic, but also just hearing where Rory is. And as Jeanette said, this is the second episode. And Rory and I have been in contact with each other so often since our last episode. And the conversation has grown, Rory. The conversation has matured. It has shifted. And I'm super excited that we can bring it into the space this evening and continue where we left off last time. Rory's one of those walking encyclopedias. I just go into a conversation with Rory and I just sit there and listen because he's just got this wealth of rich wisdom and insight and knowledge. And I find our conversations fascinating, Rory. So thank you for bringing
Likewise, Crispin. You stretch me all the time. I've got to keep coming up with another trick.
Maybe you can just introduce yourself quickly, Rory, and then we can get going.
Thanks, Crispin, and thank you, Jeanette. Hi, everyone. I really am pleased to be back on this platform, and thank you so much, Crispin and team. Last year, when we finished off, we kind of bookended the end of the year, and we kind of said, as we're getting ready to wind the year down, we were looking at, well, what does that look like? How does it feel? And we've subsequently come back into the start of our year. And just a very quick introduction in terms of a little bit of what's bugging me at the moment is half the world is actually going through elections this year. So after COVID, it's probably another one of those massive traumas, if I can put it like that, that's almost waiting to unfold. And none of us really know what's looming ahead. We kind of are hoping that what we anticipate and expect, maybe it's more of the same. We certainly don't hope to see a train smash. I mean, none of us woke up in the morning saying, let's have a bad day. And I think that's really where I want to kind of position as we're starting the beginning of this year, as we're starting these conversations. Let's start off a foundation which actually says what's in our control, what are we expectant of, and what are we anticipating for? And from a change point of view, typically what happens in a change environment is we kind of default and we say, what can go wrong? And we sit in that space in terms of let's risk mitigate all those kind of crises, activities, and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that. I want to ask us tonight to even just be in a different headspace, which actually looks at it and says, what might go right? And it's the same question, but it's the other side of the coin.
Sorry, is there somebody wanting to come in? Rory, I want to hook onto that. I shared with you that I was reading the post on LinkedIn from the Elders Foundation, and I've actually put it in the chat box for those who want to read it. And it talks nicely to what you were saying now as part of your introduction. So I just want to go there. Hope for humanity's future is rooted in the knowledge. So it's concrete, it's knowledge. We know it, that the solutions to the greatest threats we face already exist. And then our call on leaders is to show the courage and determination to implement them and lead us to a better future. And I think we're all hopeful that the elections across the globe will lead us to a better future. But what I found encouraging in that quote is, or in that post, is that actually we do have the answers. We know them. We've got them. So your steer of let's look to what can go right is a hopeful steer, in the sense that actually the answers may be right in front of us, and we just don't see it.
And Crispin, I picked up on as we were preparing for this, we were looking at how do we kind of get more awareness and socialization around the conversation. And I went in on that video piece. I watched it a few times, and I love it. Two things that stood out for me. One, I actually then did this, and I spoke to you about, I did the screenshot.
Yes.
And it's the open door, and in the door is the word hope, and next to it is remains. And for me, that was just such a good indication of what our conversation should be around today, is how do we exit at 7 o'clock? So hope remains. How do we move towards talking in a deliberately intentional, positive, sustainable way that actually starts asking what might go right, in spite of what potentially from the media is telling us what they will confidently tell us will go wrong?
You're quite right. I just read this evening, in preparation for a board meeting tomorrow, the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. And top risk is information or disinformation.
Yes.
And how the systems will use that for whatever agenda, and potentially create a hopelessness in one way or another. Sorry, we've used the word hope a lot. Can you help me just demystify it? What is, or decode it? What is hope?
So, Crispin, with your permission, I'm gonna just jump across into, because I sometimes find I avoid, and you and I have always had this conversation around the leaders in conversation is not a presentation. However, I've got a couple of nuggets that I would like to just flight, if that's okay with you.
Sure, please.
So maybe what I want to do is just talk to this one at the moment, and tell me when you can see my screen.
Yes, I can. Do you want to put it in presentation mode? There we go.
It should be coming through now.
Beautiful.
So one of the best ways that I discovered hope was during lockdown, and we were talking about that in the last conversation. Just a quick reminder, and I want to ask everybody, if you can rewind to when the president made the announcement that we were going into lockdown. I think it was a 3-day warning phase. And where were you, and what choices did you have, and where did you actually spend the initial hard lockdown? Just rewind your memory back to that. I know it was 2020, it was in March, I forget the exact date. And in my case, I went into a lockdown with our family, and very soon into lockdown, you remember how draconian it was. You weren't allowed out of your house except to go to the shops, and nobody was driving anywhere, and the streets were deserted. And it was, for the first few days, it was actually quite different. And it was around that time that we also looked at a sudden challenge that happened to us as a family. So my son, Liam, his girlfriend is a professional golfer, and I have checked with them that I can tell the story. And she came back, and she'd said to us, she just finished a tournament, and she came back and said she had a lump here in her thyroid area and the lymph. And long and short of it is that she needed to have emergency surgery literally as we started lockdown. And the consternation in our house was my son Liam says, I'm taking Ivana to hospital. And I said to him, no, you're not. You're not allowed out the house. And he's going, but that's my girlfriend. It's my job. It's my role. I must take her. And I said, but Liam, the reality is that you're kind of not even allowed to stop at the hospital. You know, they won't let you pass the gate. You know, Ivana has to go and by herself. And if you understand where we are from a healthcare point of view, we call them our heroes, our healers, and our helpers. And they were probably of our various essential services, but they were possibly the most overwhelmed. They had to start wearing all this additional layers of personal protective equipment. They had to talk through a mask, which they'd never had to do before. So just remember where we started off in this lockdown and what we didn't know. And very soon into lockdown, and that's how I want to start with this, because what is hope? And too often we kind of always go back to what was the default negative? What was the problem issue? So let's look at some research that came out of Prof. Ina Rothman and the Northwest University from a team of researchers at AfriForte. And what they did is and it was happening around the world, is that they did various deep dive surveys. And what I want to just take you across over here is that they identified, should we call them types of hope? So in other words, on the left-hand side in the vertical, it's not hopeful at all. And then we move across to a little bit of hope, to then being quite hopeful in the middle, then very hopeful on the fourth bar, and then ultimately extremely hopeful. What I want to point out to you is I've drawn the red line. As hope increases, our psychological distress level, in other words, the red portion, the higher our hope, the lower our psychological distress. In other words, there's an inverse relationship. And if you kind of track back, the higher your hopelessness, the more you are demonstrating psychological distress. So when I opened just now, I said, you know, from a change point of view, oftentimes we kind of look at what can go wrong. And from my background as a psychologist, you know, we look at it and say, let's make a diagnosis. Let's see these symptoms of overwhelm, stress, anxiety, and all the rest. And remember, Crispin, I mentioned to you that early in that lockdown, I realized I was actually, social distancing didn't work for me. If they'd been very clear and said it was physical distancing and maintain your 1.5 meters, I could have accepted that a lot better. But when they said to me social distancing, because my whole DNA is I get and give my energy with other people. And when you stop me from social distancing, how do I actually, where's my spark? So I realized very quickly that I was kind of trending left towards the low levels of hope. And as I did that, guess what? I can vouch for this. I started seeing higher levels of psychological distress. I could see I wasn't sleeping. I was grinding my teeth. I wasn't eating well. I was traumatized. I didn't feel I was adding a value to and contribution to my family. We had this discussion around, you know, Ivana needs to now, from her operation, she needs to be put into a safe space. And both her parents were in the essential services, which meant that if you've just had your thyroid removed at 21 years old, you actually need to be in a very safe, almost healing, helpful environment. And that's not going to be by having people, you know, multiply exposed in the essential services of what, you know, setting up emergency field hospitals and old age homes and all those kinds of environments. Remember, we had to go and some of us were even sanitizing the food that we brought into the house. And certainly some of the healers and the helpers and the heroes, they almost disgarbed outside and then kind of did a sanitizing kind of thing and then stepped into the threshold of their home, and they were dead scared that they were going to, in some way, shape, size, or form, contaminate their family, because none of us knew what this dreaded disease was capable of doing. So we were living with this inordinate amounts of distress, and some of it, you know, we can kind of, you know, I went into very much, as I say, that spiral over there, and I was starting to see, oh my goodness, I'm actually, hopelessness is taking over. But now, while I was doing this, fortunately, I was in a very supportive environment, and I went and I confirmed the diagnosis. I went into therapy. I went onto medication, and I looked at how do I start moving towards being more hopeful. And part of being more hopeful is I started doing my own research. I started what am I listening to? Your point, Crispin, around that misinformation and the disinformation. And I deliberately, intentionally stopped listening to the horror stories because I was trawling. I mean, I was on every website and finding out how many people are dead and, you know, what's going to happen. And I had to actually, that's not healthy or helpful for me. So I then started looking at it in terms of saying, let me start looking at what and how I can be more hopeful. And part of that was this idea of, let me research it. Let me actually deliberately, intentionally start doing more of what I was never taught. Now, here's me as a psychologist. I could tell you what stress, anxiety, overwhelm looks like. But I couldn't really tell you too much around what does hopeful look like. And it was around that time that I discovered this thing called hope manifesting in cases of trauma. And that's where we finished off the last time, Chris, when we talked around that post-traumatic growth.
Let's go back there. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes. But
So,
before we do, may I ask you a real personal question?
yeah.
So when you found yourself on the way I'm looking at the picture on the left-hand side in that hopelessness space, I'm hearing you saying you did some concrete stuff around therapy and other intervention, medication, et cetera, and research and that. What else? And you can hear me kind of just really kind of emotional when I ask the question. What else enabled that shift for Rory? Because getting into research and medication and therapies are kind of external interventions, if I could call it that. And I'm a layperson when it comes to this. What else triggered that shift, Rory?
So I think, go back to what I said earlier, social distance. Up front, I know that I am a social human being. And my DNA, and that's one of the reasons why I chose my career, is to be socially enabled. So I chose marriage. I chose having a family. I choose working environments that enable me to drink coffee, have face-to-face conversations, to shake people's hands. That's how my DNA is wired. So I looked at that and I thought, you know what? I have an incredibly loving and supportive home environment. How do I use that? And it's not about wanting them to meet my needs. This is also about how am I anticipating meeting their needs. So I had to also go inside in terms of saying, how can I serve? How can I cook a meal? How could I prepare, you know, some games for the family? How could we, instead of me just sitting and doing my research and being solo and isolated and spiraling down, I deliberately started saying, well, what makes me happy? So let's listen to music. Let's deliberately not, for example, doom scroll through the new numbers of deaths that are coming up and what's out of our control and what the army's doing or not doing and the president's latest family meeting. And eventually we even stopped watching the family meetings because you kind of, you know, they started late. And there was a lot of consultations that needed to happen and various, you know, organizations that had to be met and pacified. And it just got to be, actually, that's so much out of my control. You know, can I go to the shops? Yes or no? If you're going to change any of the rules of engagement, you know, can you get to that quickly so I know what's actually impacting me? And I try to make it sort of super practical. So for me, I then started saying, so how do I move myself to the right? As I say, therapy was one, the research was one, but Crispin, for me, it was a light switch. And I want to show you this picture now. I grappled with this. How do I actually become more hopefully minded and hopefully, because remember, we're human beings. So we got a head, we got our heart, we got our hands, and we show up as this kind of system, human system. And we're not just human doings. We're not just about the actions that we perform. We are human beings. And human beings we are thinking, feeling, and doing social creatures. So one of the things that I realized very quickly for me that made a lot of sense is how do I become more hopeful? And hope is not a dream or a wish or an optimistic, toxic positivity. It wasn't just that ethereal kind of, I'm going to be hopeful and the fairy godmother will just deliver me a Take-A-Lot package called hope. and then I can take it as a tablet and suddenly I'm more hopeful. No, no, no. This actually meant that I had to become a lot more intentional and deliberate. And I had to become, I've used 3 words there. I had to be goal directed. I actually had to have a, what am I actually need to accomplish at the end of the day that I can look back and say, today was a good day.
Yeah.
Because I'd actually lost the plot.
Yeah.
Every day when I started the day was going to be a day from hell. So until I actually shifted that, as I say, a light switch, until I shifted that to say, I choose to actually have a goal that is moving me towards sustainable positive. I am going to look at what can tomorrow and the day after tomorrow be. I'm not going to live in the past because the past is done. And I know there was a lot of focus around mindful present. But right now, my mindful present wasn't my happy space. I needed to be kind of looking a little bit beyond the mindful present. I can cope in the mindful present, but if I've got a sense of what might yet still be. So that future focus, and then it had to be around, well, what can I do? It had to become more actionable. And I think as you looked at that graph that I showed you, as people became more hopeful, you saw a rising level of low levels of distress, a kind of a decline also in the distress at the medium level, and certainly a very strong small red portion, which was, the high level of distress. Now, some of us had more distress than others, and that's part of, some days are worse than others, and some days are better than others. But what I found, for example, is that there were 2 other component pieces. So it was about that goal-directed, future-focused, day after tomorrow kind of mindset. And then it was the idea of what's in my control. How do I motivate myself? So that was my willpower, my agency. That's me. I can't wait for somebody to give that to me. That's a decision I must make. It's a decision I must take. And I must do it on a basis of, I need to become more well-informed. I need to be more creative and intentional and curious around how do I actually do that. And then one of the things that I grew up as a competitive swimmer, and I remember, just taking for granted that hours and hours of swimming in the pool every single day, perseverance, endurance, and grit. That was just that. If you wanted to get anywhere in swimming, you had to do lots of kilometers, grinding up and down the pool for a 100-meter race. It was an inordinate amount of effort to actually get to that preparation. And I looked at that, and as I say, I grew up like that. So that was my default. And if you wanted to get a better time at a race, well, you needed to put in more effort in your training. So that, and sometimes if that didn't work, well, let's try a 100-meter, let's try a 200-meter, let's try a 400-meter, let's try an 800-meter. Let's do a difference in terms of some sprints and some longer distance, some middle distance. Let's get out, let's change strokes, let's do these different things, let's do some stretching. So it was around how else can I actually aim towards improving my time? What are those mechanisms, those brainstorming activities that I can think of? And I needed to make that fun for me. So that was the one piece. Does that help you a little bit of unpacking the decoding
it does.
of
Thank you. Thank you. And I see Michelle, I'll come to your question now. I must be truthful here, Rory. When I was retrenched a couple of years ago and found myself way to the left of that chart you just shared around in a state of deep despair and hopelessness, I found this future focus extremely difficult.
Absolutely.
I couldn't think further than a day ahead.
Yeah.
And if I can just to get through today,
Yes.
I've made it. so for me, what helped me at that stage and started that shift slowly was just breaking this massive reality down into small little manageable chunks.
Yes, absolutely.
And sometimes all that I had to worry about, and that brought some relief, was just today.
Yes.
Just today. In any case, I want to come back to the post-traumatic growth because I don't want to lose that opportunity again. But Michelle's got a question. How do you guard or catch yourself against extreme optimism? Michelle says she scores really high on the optimism scale, which is potentially just as challenging.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, if I had to look at the difference between the 2 words, hope is tangibly real. It's kind of, it's a decision. Optimism is kind of like It's a more of a desire, a wish to see a better. So for me, the idea of Crispin, to your point, how do we make it just enough light for the step I'm on right now? And that hope is around, what do I need now? Optimism is kind of like, it's kind of a little bit more broader landscape. It's a wider sort of perspective. There's a lovely acronym that I was introduced to last week that I'd forgotten about, and it's HERO. And the HERO piece is actually quite interesting, because it talks around hope. H is the hope piece, which is what we're talking about now.
Hang on,
And
let
then
me
it
just
talks
put
around,
that in the chat box. So
yeah,
HERO, yeah,
yeah. So H is
so it's-
hope,
yeah.
efficacy,
Oh, now
which
how
is the
can you spell that?
effectiveness. Yeah, the effectiveness of
You got
you'll
me
be good,
there.
double F.
If. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah.
And then resilience. Now, I remember
Ah,
during lockdown, that was probably the most overused word that we actually get through.
yeah.
Was, you know, we were encouraged to be more resilient. And I mean, there's also a limit to how resilient you can actually be. You know, they talk around resilience being a bounce back, but actually that's beyond perseverance and endurance and grit. You know, bounce back is more than, you know, and the point is, I think it probably was one of the most overused words in the early part of lockdown, you know, and everybody was invited to just be more resilient. And I'm going, how? I don't have that capacity, or that I can't deep dive into myself. I need to let me get there more slowly. I need to find my own way to do that. And then Michelle, to the O is the optimism. So we do need to have a kind of like should we call it a future vision or a future focus that can be better than today? Now, that's in one way a definition for me of hope. But hope links to optimism, because optimism is around, you know, the glass half full versus the glass half empty. It's the same reality. But you see the same perspective from, oh, it's only half a glass. Well, it's already half a glass. So the optimism is just a way of engaging with that factual reality. But hope for me is a different way of embracing it.
So Rory, with that, let's just circle back to where we bookmarked towards the end of our first episode, where you spoke about post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
And many of us can identify with post-traumatic stress. I think many of us are finding and experiencing some form of trauma in the workplace, whether it is it comes from ourselves, or it's the environment, or it's the context within which we find ourselves. Just unpack for me, please, or for us on the call, post-traumatic hope. Or growth.
Absolutely.
Post-traumatic growth. Yeah.
So what I'd like to do, and again, I've got a quite a nice one, because I want to also talk around hope. Oftentimes is misunderstood. So I want to just give us a perspective shift around what is actually a way of embracing and engaging with hope. So if you don't mind, I'm going to quickly go back and just pick up a different screen.
Was that a slip when I said post-traumatic hope and not post-traumatic?
Post-traumatic hope, yeah. It's called post-traumatic growth. Let me just jump ahead. I want to go to this slide here. So you've just done a mind shift reframe. So you've called it, there's a term in the literature and the research that's called post-traumatic growth, as opposed to post-traumatic stress disorder. Remember we said what can go wrong versus what can go right.
Yeah.
But what I want to is, let's reframe, and it's a mindset change, okay? We all know that hope is measurable. I hope we all know that. You can actually determine how hopeful. I've shown you that from the far left going across, not hopeful going across. So hope is measurable. Are you aware that hope is teachable? And kind of what we're talking about now is we're actually doing a little bit of teaching around what is hope. How might it show up? But if it's teachable, that means you almost need to approach it. I'm prepared to learn. I'm prepared to embrace it. I'm prepared to find out more what I didn't know. But here's what I find fascinating. And that research that Ina that showed over there is ultimately what we started seeing through the lockdown period is that levels of hope. The worst case scenario was that they said to us it was the greatest psychological experiment ever conducted on humanity. I think 6 billion people went into shelter at home, forced lockdowns of various sorts. New Zealand, amongst others, was one of the worst, for example. And what you found is that they said that we are going to pay the cost and the consequence of this decision. And so they almost talked around a tsunami of ill health, and particularly mental ill health. So my story was that social kind of component. For me, it came up in that space. So it wasn't just around a diagnosis of hopelessness, but it was that sense of it's out of my control. I have to react to whatever I've been told, or what I can and can't do. But what is interesting is that hope is personal. It's up to an individual.
Say that again. Hope
is personal.
Personal.
And it's up to an individual to literally say, I'm okay with the level of hope or hopelessness that I am at, or I'm not comfortable staying in the zone of, like you said, when you were retrenched, that you went into. And over a period of time, I'm curious, what shifted you from literally the next hour to the end of the day to the next day? What helped you through that, Crispin?
Rory, what helped me through it was small little victories. Because what happened, and I mean, I think we can all identify with that when something like that happens, you lose your identity, your self-worth, you lose your confidence, you lose so many aspects of who you are as a person, from incredibly successful to unemployed within 24 hours. I mean, it's quite dramatic.
And especially in your role as a man, as a father, as a provider, as a husband.
Especially in that role, exactly. And it was over Christmas time, so Christmas and gifts and all of that. But what got me through it was, and I'm an introvert, so for me, naturally connecting and reaching out doesn't come naturally. But part of my saving was people who reached out to me.
Right.
People who spoke into my life in incredible ways. And as I started believing what I'm capable of doing again, and started giving a sense of what you had there is, hang on, but this could happen. This could be possible.
So it was building confidence, I'm hearing.
It was building confidence. It was building. You know what I also had? Sorry, we off the topic completely. But what I had to get over was forgiveness.
Right.
And maybe Michelle, you can help here. But I had to forgive myself that this thing that had happened wasn't my fault.
That's huge.
And
oftentimes that's your immediate response.
That is my default response.
Yeah.
That I screwed up, or I didn't see it coming, or whatever the case may be. So getting to terms with the truth, and that's why what we do in Boundless Wisdom is so powerful for me, because we try and understand wisdom as truth,
right,
transferred and translated into action. And many conversations I have with leaders when we coaches, but what's the truth? It's really happening with you and your circumstances and your situation. So I'm rambling on a bit, Rory, but getting back to who I am, identity, and what's the truth was important. And one of those steps I had to take was self-forgiveness.
Right.
Along the way.
And Crispin, that's what I call this reframing. It's seeing that same reality. You're not changing the fact that you're retrenched or unemployed, but what you are seeing is what else. Now think about when you're driving a vehicle, and as you're driving that vehicle, Crispin, a stone hits your windscreen in front of your eyes. What happens to your peripheral vision? Because you were aware of a truck just over there, you were aware of a motorbike coming past because you knew it was a Harley Davidson in your blind spot, and you knew that you needed. And the next thing, the stone hits your windscreen right in front of your eyes. Where does your vision go to?
Right there.
Right in front of you. So you lose your peripheral vision. Immediately here.
Yeah.
So the first step is, how do we actually even engage and increase when every chemical in your brain is firing to fight and flight? You are in survival mode. And in survival mode, you're not going to be listening to great music or enjoying a good dinner in terms of the flavors and the textures and or smelling perfume. It's just outside of your survival zone. So the peripheral vision and that focus, and the problem is we sit there too long. That's
Yeah.
why I say it's a
Yeah.
decision, it's a reframe. And that's where oftentimes I found I couldn't do that by myself. I had my family, my near and dear loved ones who actually were incredibly helpful. Then I also had my psychologist. I had a whole lot of people that were checking in on me. And what they did is they actually said, listen, get out of that dark hole and move towards, it's a choice. And that's when I started realizing, and this is what I want to say, post-traumatic growth. What the research, and this came out in the late 90s from research done by Tedishi and Calhoun. And from positive psychology, they were looking at it from a point of view, psychology up until then, and even when I did my training early in the 90s, the key philosophical question that we were asked is, should we be following the medical model of diagnosis in terms of what's wrong? Or is there alternatives, or are there alternatives? And part of that alternative that came through is this thing called, a new strain of psychology came through when Martin Seligman became the head of the Psychology Association. And he brought in a positive psychology lens. And just the very nature of the word, positive psychology, it's almost like what can go right. So what we were looking at is, instead of just finding the people that were not coping, the left of those bar graphs that I showed you, the lost hope, but how can we work with the people that are higher hope? And how can we work with them so that we can actually see how they can also pass their knowledge, their wisdom, their hopefulness? Because if you work for a leader who is hopeful, they catalyze hope in you. They encourage, they ignite, they invite that hope. So you yourself can be not very hopeful, but if you're working with a hopeful leader, they are reaching into a part of you, and they are drawing that portion of our humanity out, which says tomorrow can be better than today. There's a great line that I remember learning from a Malawi friend of mine, and he said, the hour before dawn is the darkest hour. Nature knows that the sun is going to rise, but it's also the coldest hour. And it's the darkest hour. So it's almost this paradox that the light is coming, not yet. Wow. And so if we are aware of these kind of things, and if we understand the rhythms of what we are engrossed and engaged with, the first thing that they did in the research is that they found 5 key levers. And the first one was people that have been traumatized. And the reality is we're all traumatized, especially if you live in South Africa with load shedding and water issues and the economy and all the other stuff that we're dealing with. I mean, we have probably, short of a war zone, we have probably the highest youth unemployment rate in the world. We are world leaders, not just in our rugby, but in a lot of negative metrics as well. But what they found with people that are traumatized, that get through the trauma, one of the triggers or levers or mechanisms that they have this incredible sense of gratitude and appreciation, even of the trauma, because it actually brings them to a different, and in most cases, a better space of who they can be.
Sure.
I met a guy when I was doing work in the early 2000s. I was doing skills development work, and one of the targets that we had to source was disabled folks into workplaces for learnerships. And we found a particular person who headed up one of the disability groups, the quadriplegic group. And I remember being blown away with Ari Sorelis. He actually would, I said to him, Ari, you were riding a quad bike, you had an accident, and now you're a quadriplegic. And in order for him to, as a quadriplegic, in terms of this disability group, what he did is he almost front-ended. How could he bring a sense of what else and hope and so on to his other quadriplegics? And so he started a thing, and I remember it was called Quad for Quads. He got able-bodied people riding quad bikes to raise money for people like him who had been quadrupleized from a quad bike. I mean, go see the paradox in all of that, the irony in all of that. And he said, thank goodness that happened to me, because I'm a better person now than I was before. And he had a whole new sense of, almost a sense of cause and purpose and meaning. And because he had gone through a personal travesty, tragedy, but through that, he had appreciated and he had gratitude for what he is still becoming. And it was more than what he was before. How profound was that? He was able to look at it. Remember I said to you peripheral vision? He was able to look at it in terms of
Mm.
new opportunities. What else
Mm.
might be? The art of the possible.
Mm.
And he was looking at it in terms of, how else can I help my other quadriplegics? How else can I help other disabled people? Oh, learnerships. How can we get our disabled folks into this? Let me find out which other organizations have got disabled folks that don't know about what we're busy with. How does he? And so he started reaching out. He became my biggest champion of actually finding disabled people. And as a disabled person, when he approached them, he got a lot more gravitas and a lot more buy-in than I did as a non-disabled folk.
Mm. Mm.
Because he was one of them. But he was one of them who was different. He had that appreciation and gratitude. He was able to see what might yet be and become. People that have gone through this level of trauma, they find that they no longer have all the, should we call it the obligatory relationships, the many people, lots of shallow and almost irrelevant kind of connections, but we keep ourselves busy and we go to them because it's expected. They focus that down and they say, you know what, I've got 10 people, 5 people that I'm going to spend and invest my time, effort, and energy, and they're going to give to me and I'm going to give to them. And they get rid of the peripheral. They make a deliberate choice. Life for me is about meaning and purpose and value, and I'm going to put my time and my effort and my energy where I can see and give and get return based on that. And an amazing thing, I think about when you often hear people tell stories of a motor vehicle accident, they will recount how the car was upside down and suddenly they had this incredible adrenaline strength. They were able to physically move the car by themselves. That strength, we don't even know we have it. But again, our body kicks in with adrenaline, with those different survival instincts. And the fifth one is what they found is this idea that there is I call it wisdom. There's a change in perspective. There's an appreciation, gratitude. There's these new possibilities, things that we didn't see before. And it actually sometimes can fundamentally change. I'm not saying it has to be religious. It can be. Yes. That's why I call it wisdom. So it's around how you frame your world. And that's why I call it that shift and reframe. But let me show you what it looks like then, Crispin, if you want me to talk post-traumatic growth specifically. So
yes, because I want to circle back to the point you made about being a hopeful leader, please. And
perfect.
What that looks like and what are the kind of head and heart and skill sets required for that. But happy for you to
I hope this picture then kind of solidifies and consolidates that. We are in our now, whether we like it or don't like it. It is our here and now. Okay. And we are aiming towards what can yet still be and become. So let's call it next, now and next. Yes. And if you think about it, that's where we are all the time. You know, multiple times in a day even. So if you take that's our journey from where we are now, whether we like it or don't like it, whether it's desirable or undesirable, whether we want more of it or want less of it, we're anticipating that our future can be next, better, more. That's a human nature thing. Some recent research that came out of America, and I was reading a brilliant thing called The Science of Hope. And part of this research, and I'd never seen it before, it was literally published late last year, and the article I was reading was literally from early this year. And they talk around human beings in America. They use that as their survey sample. But let me give you this: 82% of people are hopeful that their personal life and their personal future will be better. 82% of us. So we kind of think, if you think back to my model, my little graph that I showed you, the hopeless, helpless on the left-hand side, 82% of us are hopeful for our own future. That's an overwhelming majority. And yet, that's the positive psychology kind of look. That's a human disposition. It's part of our DNA. The future of our immediate family, 85% were hopeful for that for their own immediate family, even higher than for their own personal. In other words, as a parent, you want more for your children. Yeah. Even the future of my local community, the area in which I live and move and have my being, that was 74%.
Sure.
And then when they started getting a little bit wider in terms of their circle of influence, and they said, you know, what's your hope around America in terms of America as a nation going forward? only 56% of the people were hopeful for a future of America in its sort of current form and being of influence and so on. And what was very interesting is that 44% were kind of looking at how will humanity grapple and grasp with the overwhelming complexity and challenges, climate change, wars, water shortages. Only 44% of people are sitting in a hopeful state and space. So the further it gets away from me and my family and my community, the less we are hopeful, okay? But what they found absolutely fascinating is that the mental health, whether you see your mental health as good and positive, overwhelmingly 90% of those people had hopeful concepts of their own future. Where people identified that their mental health was challenged and it wasn't where they would like it to be, and they were acknowledging that my mental health is actually compromised. It is less than what I would like. Only 49% of those people could see a hopeful future for themselves. Wow. That is a radical difference. Now, the differential is not just around what is, my circle of influence and control. It's where am I inside of me? Now, remembering our mental health is not just how we think.
It's how we are.
It's also how we feel.
Yeah.
And it's also what we do.
Yeah.
Because we are an intricate, so here's the reality. You all know VUCA, the volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and the variations on that theme. I like this, and it's from Paulo Gully. He talks around chaos. Think about the chaos of the pandemic. Think about the chaos of Y2K. Think about how much complexity there was around Y2K, and we kind of watched the sunrise on the far side of New Zealand, and actually the computers didn't crash. And then it moved across, and eventually it came to, and it was almost like a damn squib because we've done so much risk mitigation. So even in complexity, we've got a way through and around. And crisis is a beautiful word because crisis talks two parts. I've just shown you. There's the opportunity piece, and then there's the danger piece. And the Chinese have this in one word, they're able to pull these two. When you look at it as an English speaker, you look at crisis, and if I ask you what your definition of crisis, I guarantee it'll be negative. Okay? Then you've got the other two C's, confusion and change. But now here's what we've been talking around. I have a choice. It's in my power to make that choice. I can make that choice to negative and stay stuck in my hopeless, in my undesirable now, and say, woe is me, and I'm waiting for the knight in shining armor to come and rescue me on a white steed. And we did that in the early part of COVID. We were waiting for God knows what, a vaccine or something, the president, the army. But we also had to take control at the level of me, myself, and my family, and my business, and things like that. So that choice, and I'm looking at the choice and saying the choice to, the choice for. And we always look at the choice against, the fear-driven choice. Well, actually, I've just given you the statistics. We are majority overwhelmingly hopeful and positive. Why are we not choosing to move in that direction? So there I overlay that with the post-traumatic growth that we've just been through. So now I bring those 5 levers in, and then I say, well, what does that look like from a point of what does post-traumatic growth look like in the workplace? We've taken it from a trauma point of view. We've taken it from things that can go wrong, COVID, financial crisis, Y2K, you name whatever it is. And then I'm saying this is the Hope Fuel model. Hope Fuel is if a business during lockdown didn't put care and compassion for their people first, they pretty much are no longer in business. Yeah, we can all relate to that. Suddenly our bosses were talking to us and we had Teams meetings, and the first thing was, how are you doing? There were check-ins. We saw people in their home environments, and the dog ran over the screen or whatever it was. We saw, but there was care and compassion that I think had not been around for a long time. It wasn't the patch and the band-aid in terms of we'll just go and phone ICAS or EAP or whatever that health provider is, or fix yourself. It was actually a far more systemic approach in terms of us as a business, as an organization, as a team. Let's look out and after each other. And then linked to that, if I go back to those possibilities, I was telling you the story of Aristoteles. What about that curiosity? What about that creativity around what can be? And oftentimes when I post, I often talk around the unfolding as yet unknown. And oftentimes our children are desperate to get older. My daughter is desperate. She's now 18. She's desperate. And I'm kind of, can you just go back to being my daughter, my little girl? You know, I want to, but the world is her oyster. You know, she has this, she's invincible. You know, Oscar Wilde was so right. He talked around, you know, youth is wasted on the young. And then that next piece around connection. And connection there is around, you know, in our workplaces, we were always talking around teams and social human beings and the collaboration. And if you look at where all our innovations are happening, it's happening in team environments. Very seldom is something invented just by one person or by themselves in a dark room. And then the next one, remember personal strength, and I gave you the story of that, you know, the adrenaline and so on, but look at it from a point of view of courage. And last time, Crispin, you remember, we had Anne Pratt on the call, and I specifically asked her, I said, Anne, can I just relate your story of courage? Because for me, it is so profound. And then lastly is that piece around, from a wisdom point of view, it's that purpose, meaning, and cause. So I try to keep the logic of the 5 C's, but would you rather be living in chaos, crisis, complexity, confusion, or change, or would you want to be in a space of care, curiosity, connection, courage, and cause? It's a choice, because you could be in but you can't be in both. You've got to be in one or the other.
And to hook onto that, and I think I've answered the question now, or you've answered the question around what is a hopeful leader? I love that concept of hope fuel. But what's coming through for me is the capability, the ability, if that's the right word, of a leader to play in the space of those top 5 C's. The leader who actually authentically cares.
Yes.
The leader who authentically is curious not only about the health and the wellness of the individual, but of the system that they are leading.
Yes.
The leader who is actually able to make those really deep personal connections. And I think that's why so many people are struggling with getting back to work and getting into some rhythm.
Yes, absolutely.
of hybrid working. The leader was courageous, and we spoke about this in so many of our LICs, you know, this whole thing about a leader who's authentic and courageous and acknowledges, I don't know, I don't have all my stuff together. And reintroducing this really powerful concept of purpose and cause into our teams and into our organization. Rory, I just have a sense that we're actually just scratching the surface. I have such a need to actually do such a deep dive into, you know, how do you actually make this happen, and how do you build the capability in organizations and in leadership teams to exercise choice and to operate and play in that well-being and sustainable impact space as you have it there on the slide.
Yeah. And I think that for me is the exciting piece, Crispin, is that we have this opportunity. And you know, I've come through my career, and I've been, the last portion of my career, I was actually involved in a lot of change. But I also learned a valuable lesson. Probably my biggest project I ever ran was in the early 90s. Completely unskilled. Jeanette, you were in the factory environment with me at the time when we were doing the apprentice training and all that kind of stuff. And literally, there was a chance to do a learning intervention, which fundamentally kept our factory alive, as opposed to shutting down 3,000 jobs and bringing the product in from Brazil cheaper. But the process to get there, Crispin, number one is it involved me writing a memo to the head office in London and justifying a business case. That took me 6 months. It was on a 1-page document.
Sure.
But the boss that worked with me on that taught me probably my most profound lesson I've ever learned in business. It should only be 1 page. If you can't put it on 1 page, you're not clear in your thinking. The problem that I had is that once we got it approved, is that was the non-negotiable. You will now deliver. And very quickly I realized, as we started launching this thing, we ran into challenges that we hadn't anticipated. So I'll give you the biggest challenge that happened. The workers that we were going to retrain and multi-skill and put 10 days of training, we were spending 15% of payroll on keeping this factory going on a timeline, on a time frame, and we were given permission. And if you remember at that time, it was even before skills legislation came to South Africa, where they were starting to ask for a measly 0.5%, and then it was going to go to 1%. We were spending 15%. And I had a boycott by the very people that needed to go on training because they wanted a pie and Coke at lunchtime.
Sure.
And I had not budgeted a pie and Coke at lunchtime. And so we had a standoff. And what prepares you for that standoff? When you've got management saying you will not move and budge, you've got a deliverable, you've got 3 years left, the deadline is not extended. And you've got the union that's arrived over here and says, actually, we're entitled to have a pie and Coke at lunchtime. And both parties are right, but you've got to find a way to get between the now and the next. You've got to find a way to bridge. And I think a hopeful leader is a bridge builder.
Yes.
Oftentimes we see, and John Maxwell wrote about this recently. In fact, I think it was Jeanette who shared that article with me. John Maxwell kind of gives a couple of beautiful pointers. And he says, signs of a leader of hope is that they will build bridges where other people burn them down. And have you worked with a leader who actually intentionally, deliberately, actually is a bridge burner? Or have you worked and can you recount a bridge builder? And what was the difference for you in your career? And how did you feel? As I say, hopeful leaders pull people towards better next. Hope,
thank you.
Should we call it the bridge burner? They create this almost more toxic kind of environment. It's unhealthy. It's unpleasant. It doesn't matter what you do. It's not good enough. It's always late. You know, that kind of a environment where it doesn't matter how hard you work, you're on a hiding to nowhere.
I like that, and I think it's a lovely way of just wrapping it up and tying the bow on it, Rory. I like to just, if there's time, we have about 5 minutes left. If there aren't any questions or comments in the chat, please, or thoughts that you'd like to just pop there, and as we wrap up and get to the end. Rory, I think that's a really powerful way of pulling it together, this concept of bridge builder versus bridge burner.
Yeah.
Where to from here? And maybe as a last wrap up for us, where to from here? What would be your parting words of wisdom and insight? And I think we need to go back to the drawing board, Rory, and see how we can take what we've got here and really do a deep dive for people on it, in some form or another.
Go back to what I said just now, that hope is measurable and it's teachable. There's some phenomenal research that's coming out, and there are brilliant programs that are out there, but we're not yet teaching hope enough. If I look at my context in South Africa, I'm trying to do this, but my sense is that I have some colleagues, and it's a new field. Yeah. A colleague that I work very closely with in the United States, she's United Nations Ambassador for Mental Health, but particularly she's rebranded Hope. And Catherine Getzker has got a beautiful, awesome research that she has made available and sharing, and that's the kind of thing, it's teachable.
Yeah.
And she's confirmed it. She's done hardcore research to say it is teachable. Yeah. And what all that could look like at a curriculum level. I'm gung-ho. I want to do this in workplace. The workplace I want to influence and impact the most, Crispin, is healthcare.
Yes.
Those healers, helpers, and heroes that actually were probably the most traumatized, that probably have the highest levels of burnout, that are probably the most overwhelmed. And what we're seeing is increasing levels of suicidality, measures and metrics that are just showing up that our healthcare is in crisis.
And it's true for education and educators. I mean, if there's a pivotal space where one can impact on it, it should include education.
Absolutely.
I mean, well,
and that's where the teaching piece comes in. You know, if we can teach this to our kids, if we can do this to our healing environment, you know, in terms of it's not just put a plaster on after the event, but if we can proactively teach, how can we risk mitigate that we are aware of the choice towards hope and the consequences of spiraling into hopelessness.
Rory, thank you. We have a minute left. I just feel terrible that I have to pull, to stop at this point. We're just really, again, starting to get the conversation going. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for your time. Thank you for just being so truthful about your own reality and your experience and your learnings. It's impacted on me very deeply, and I really do appreciate that. Jeanette, are you on the call, and could you wrap up for us, please, and conclude?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much, Rory and Crispin. And Rory, thank you for that invitation, asking each one of us to introspect ourselves in terms of where we are at in terms of hope and the choices that we make ourselves. And once again, as leaders, realizing the impact that we can have on people around us. We could actually be fueling hope, or we could be part of creating more crisis amongst people and creating more negativity as we go along. So thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for being on the call. We will have the recording available. And I know Crispin was sort of indicating that maybe there's a bit of a deeper dive, Rory, that we need to go into regarding this, and we will keep you posted. Thank you very much. Please go out there, be hopeful, and create hope in every circle, in every area where you have impact on people around you. It's teachable, it's learnable, and it's increasable. So let's go out there and increase hope for everyone else around us. Thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Crispin, as
Bye-bye.
always. Jeanette,
Thank
you.
you, Rory. Take care.
Goodbye.